Good evening and welcome to the 2020 Superintendent of Public Instruction Candidate Forum, hosted by the North Carolina Association of Public Charter Schools and the North Carolina Coalition for Charter Schools. My name is Lindalyn Kakadelis and I am the Executive Director for the Coalition. Many voters do not realize that charter schools exist in a very fragile political world. Between disparities in funding and the never-ceasing regulatory creep, charter school staff and boards persevere to provide quality education for each student attending. The 2019 Annual Charter Report acknowledges that charter students in elementary, middle, and high school on average perform academically higher than district schools on English language arts across every grade and every subgroup. Thank you for your passionate work and dedication to your student success. The 2020-21 school year has opened in unprecedented times, and the 2020 election will also occur in unprecedented times due to the global pandemic we faced. Elections have consequences, and we all wanted to hear directly from the candidates that are seeking to manage the Department of Public Instruction. Last week, we heard from the Democrat candidate, Jen Mangrum, and tonight we will hear from the Republican candidate, Catherine Truitt. Feel free to submit your questions in the chat box, and if we have time, we will ask the candidate. If not, we will compile the questions and get with a candidate and get back in touch with you. You can also access this forum on the association's Facebook page if necessary. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda Dillingham, the Executive Director of the Association of Public Charter Schools. She will introduce our moderator for tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lindalyn. The North Carolina Association for Public Charter Schools is thrilled to be co-hosting this forum because the race for Superintendent of Public Instruction is vital to the continuance of our state's charter schools. You know, the strength of the association is in our three-pronged approach to advancing the charter school movement in our state. That is in programming support and education of the public, as well as legislative advocacy. That's why we partnered with the coalition to bring you two opportunities to meet the candidates for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Last week with Dr. Jen Mangrum, and this week with Republican candidate, Chancellor Catherine Truitt. Welcome, Ms. Truitt, and I'd also like to welcome our moderator, Ms. Donna Martinez. Donna is Vice President of Marketing and Communications with the Locke Foundation. With her colleague, Mitch Kokai, she co-hosts Carolina Journal Radio, a weekly syndicated radio show heard on more than a dozen stations. With her husband, Rick, she co-hosts a daily radio show on News Radio 680 WPTF. Thank you for facilitating our forum tonight, Donna. We're glad to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Rhonda and Lindalyn. Very glad to be here with you. Very honored that you asked me to join you this evening. So thank you to both the North Carolina Association for Public Charter Schools and the North Carolina Coalition for Charter Schools. The person who is elected superintendent will have a consequential job, excuse me, in our state. And so my mission tonight as moderator is to try to help viewers understand a little bit more about the candidates. As you mentioned, last week we chatted with the Democratic Party's nominee, Jen Mangrum. Tonight, our guest is the Republican Party's nominee, Catherine Truitt. Now, Catherine Truitt's education path is really interesting. She began as a high school English teacher. She spent 10 years in the classroom teaching at both the high school and middle school levels. Her last 3 years as a teacher were spent at West Johnston High School. She taught English to 11th and 12th grade students. Then in 2015, Governor Pat McCrory appointed her to serve as his senior advisor on education. She was developing strategic state education policy goals. Now, Catherine Truitt presently serves as Chancellor of nonprofit Western Governors University in North Carolina. Chancellor, so glad to have you with us tonight. Before we begin our conversation, why don't you take a minute or two to share your opening thoughts, your vision for education in North Carolina, particularly in light of the 200 plus public charter schools, which serve more than 120,000 students.
Thanks, Donna, so much for the opportunity, and thanks to both the coalition and the association. It's really a thrill to be here with you all tonight. I think that I'm sure that throughout the course of the evening, we'll get to those things that I feel we're doing well and those things that we can improve upon. But I want to focus on that part of your question that is about my vision in terms of charter schools. I think that we have been seeing a trend in public education, both in the United States and North Carolina, that COVID has only accelerated. And that trend is this. Parents have more options than ever before when it comes to how they're going to educate their students. And with the growth of that school choice movement, which I really think of as parent choice, comes this idea of the parent as consumer when it comes to public K-12 education. And because of that, what I'm seeing with a lot of our superintendents across the state is a new paradigm that is that the children that we are educating are everyone's responsibility. And I know superintendents who support, do outreach and support families in their district who are homeschooling, superintendents who will reach out to the principal at a private school, superintendents that will work with the charter school in their community. I think that it's critical that those of us who work in education to improve outcomes for all children take this view and stop pitting certain groups against another. This is what parents want. The parent is always the best person to decide what is right for their child, not the state. And I'm happy to say that this trend is only going to continue.
Chancellor, why do you believe that? It's an interesting phrase you used, parent as consumer. We don't hear that often, at least to my ear, when we talk about education for K through 12 in our state. Do you feel that your view is held by other people who are working in education here?
And please call me Catherine. Yeah, I think it is, Donna, because I hear people in the education community talking about this. People might not be writing about it yet or citing data around this yet, but I think it is, like I said, it's a philosophy of education and a paradigm shift for many. It's even hard for me to get my head around the idea that a superintendent would take an interest in what's going on in the private school in their area, for example. But the truth is that it is becoming more and more common for, let's take a child who perhaps starts off being homeschooled for the first 3 years of her life. And then that for whatever reason doesn't work for that family anymore. And so that child now attends the charter school in her neighborhood. That charter school ends at 8th grade, so that child is now going to go to her neighborhood public high school. That child has had a variety of different education experiences, all in the same community, and it behooves those of us working in education and communities to pay attention to that child's specific education experiences.
So if parents are consumers, what about the wait list then for charter schools? About 65,000 students on a wait list. What's your view on that? Should there be a cap or should there be enrollment growth?
There should not be a cap. As those parents are taxpayers, and they can vote with their feet in terms of electing or not electing officials who are willing to have policies that are pro-charter school, but I really don't understand why we would cap something that families are clearly saying that they want.
You know, last week when we spoke with your opponent, Democrat Dr. Jen Mangrum, and we talked about this issue of charter schools on wait lists, she said that she would like to reestablish a 100 school cap on charter schools. So fair to say that's a distinction between the two of you.
Yes, because we have 184 charter schools. So if we went back down to 100, we would be closing down 84 schools that children are attending, and because they've made a choice to attend this school, they and their parents must be satisfied with that school.
You mentioned COVID in your opening statement. Let's talk a little bit about that. Has COVID kind of made you think differently about education in our state? And if so, how? And specifically, give us your thoughts about Governor Cooper and his use of emergency powers, executive orders when it comes to education.
Okay, lots in there. So I'll start with the governor's emergency powers order. I'm not a legal scholar, but my understanding is that there should have been greater consultation with the Council of State when the governor opted to close down all schools. From the earliest days of my campaign, pre-COVID, I have said that I am a proponent of local control. For me, what that means is that it is up to local leaders to decide, alongside the local superintendents, their school boards, local health officials in the case of COVID, how they are going to carry out their constitutional obligation to provide a sound basic education for students in their community. So I appreciate that the governor was in a difficult decision back in March. What I don't really agree with is the uncertainty that he caused when he delayed and waffled with the decision to let schools and parents know what was happening in July. I just talked to a parent today who said that was an incredibly stressful time, and they ended up having to quit their job because of that indecision. I think that right now, what we're seeing is what I have recommended from the beginning, which is from the time that the three plans A, B, and C were released, I would have preferred that all three plans be on the table, because we had small districts in our smaller rural counties that had very, very low infection rates and could have open schools safely. And coincidentally, some of our most vulnerable children attend those small rural schools. I would also add that while I'm happy that the governor has finally put Plan A back on the table, and just before we started tonight, I saw a text come through on my phone that Wake County Public Schools, where my own children attend, have sent out some sort of proposed phase-in plan that I've not had a chance to look at yet. But the truth is that our larger districts are not necessarily going to open the way some of our smaller districts might. So again, but local control means that as state superintendent, I have to accept what local superintendents choose, even when I don't agree with it.
You know, I noticed on your website, speaking of local control, that one of the things that you have on your website says that you'd like to give local officials control, you'd like to give parents a voice, and give children hope. So do you think that Governor Cooper's plan is doing those things? And if yes, why? But if not, what would you do differently? How would you be advising the governor?
Well, it's giving those things to some kids, but not all kids. So now we're left with an equity problem. So if we wanted equity, then what we would have had to do is he would have had to say all schools must open, because now we're left with some children who will be in class sooner. I think everyone's in agreement. And certainly all of the research that I see come across my desk every morning is showing that 100% remote learning and even the hybrid models are not working for the majority of students. And so I think that what we're left with is with some schools or some of our larger districts not opening, is a lot of kids still stuck at home in an untenable situation for them and their families.
Right now, with the governor's latest order, it's K through 5 that has the option of opening up to in-person instruction just a few days down the road. Do you agree with that? Do you think it should be all schools, or how would you approach that?
I think it should be all schools, but I also would add that there needs to be a recognition that our larger schools, in particular our high schools, do need to get their houses in order, so to speak, so that they can open safely. Safety should be the number one priority. My reopening plan is three-pronged. It's safety, remediation, and growth. And what I would hope is that our larger districts are going to tackle this problem head on. It is inconvenient to have to solve for this problem, and it will be difficult, but it's not impossible. And we have incredible numbers of mental health issues that we're seeing with our older students trapped at home. Not to mention the fact that the learning loss, which is estimated at 70% for math and 50% for reading across all grades, is something that some kids will never catch up to.
Well, your second item there that you mentioned was remediation, and based on what's happening and what you said you're hearing from parents about, kids being at home, is this a lost year of learning?
Donna, I keep picturing like a seesaw teetering over a precipice, and those kids who were kind of in the middle have now fallen into the chasm, which is a very bleak picture. Right now, pre-COVID, only 14% of African-American 8th graders were reading and doing math proficiently headed into 9th grade, and only 28% of Hispanic 8th graders are. Overall, 65% of kids in North Carolina do not read and do math proficiently headed into 9th grade. And now this is going to see us fall back even more. I mean, that 65% means we're talking about most kids. And then when we disaggregate that by subgroup, it's I have called this a few times now the greatest civil rights crisis in this new century, that we have not been able to crack the nut on this reading issue for the past over 30 years. And the achievement gap between low-income kids and their wealthier counterparts is still 30 points, and it has been since the 90s.
So based on your description, and particularly those kids in the middle and the way you described the precipice there, what does that mean for next year? Hopefully we make our way out of COVID-19. There's a vaccine. We get back more to, quote, normal times. Let's say you're elected superintendent. What is it that you're going to be recommending, no matter who the governor is or who the members of the State Board of Education are, because you're going to have to work with everyone if you're the superintendent. What would you say to them needs to be done based on 2020 and what's happening now?
Every piece of research that I've read about COVID recovery plans recommends that we do serious diagnostic work when kids come back. So not during a hybrid time or, not in early September when kids were first coming back to school this school year. But when kids come back to school physically, that there needs to be all hands on deck for providing the most accurate data on where kids are in reading and math. And then that needs to be followed by targeted remediation in reading and math only, even if that means at the expense of other subjects. And then it also means that we continue to prioritize growth, and our progress monitoring should focus on the rate of improvement of students in reading and math.
Do you think you would be able to convince the education bureaucracy to take a little bit different approach as you've described it?
That's a great question, because I do not have any regulatory authority as state superintendent over our local superintendents. One of my strengths is building consensus and working across multiple channels to ensure all voices are heard. And so this will take presenting a set of recommendations in the form of a plan that districts can choose to use or not. But what I know from COVID is that we have a lot of districts out there that are looking just for that. They're looking for a solid plan because they need help. Not all districts are going to take that stance. They may say, no, we've got this. But certainly the Office of the State Superintendent, in conjunction with the State Board of Education, needs to provide guidance. And I would say even a specific plan that they could choose to follow on what this recovery should look like. We're not in recovery yet.
As you describe this kind of collaboration, that's my interpretation, listening to your description of how you would approach it. I was kind of interested in that a couple of days ago, I know you and your opponent, Dr. Mangrum, were able to be together for a forum with the North Carolina Association of School Administrators. And based on the reporting on that, that issue of relationships, and in particular the General Assembly, came up, and your opponent said to you, and this is a quote from the News and Observer, your party wants to starve public education and put money into private schools. That's not what I'm about. And so if that means going toe to toe with the leadership in the General Assembly, I'm in it, and I'm going to do it for the administrators who are out there and for teachers everywhere. Give me your assessment of that statement, not only about the relationship with the General Assembly, but is there really a tension between legislators and people who are in schools?
Well, I'm going to start with my assessment. The word that I used to respond to her was short-sighted. And I have heard my opponent within the same 45 minutes of a debate or a forum say, the General Assembly has failed. And then 5 minutes later, she will say, I want to go toe to toe with the General Assembly. And then 5 minutes later, will say, I can work with the General Assembly. I think that what the state superintendent needs to understand is that the legislature, no matter who is in charge, controls the purse strings. So while we may make recommendations and advocate for those things which are important for stronger student outcomes, having a contentious relationship with the legislature is always a bad idea. And quite frankly, she's burned some bridges with Senator Berger in her behavior in another campaign with him. And so I would contend that when the data is in front of us and the facts are on the table, and we want to have a real honest conversation about funding, we have to be honest about where we are with funding And where we are is that low-income schools are receiving 33% more funding than schools that are not low income. And so while the pie may not have gotten as large as some groups may want, our outcomes haven't improved in the last 35 years. And the money that we are appropriating to public schools is targeted. So it's given to, you know, if I'm an average public school student in North Carolina, I'm going to get about $7,900 in as a per pupil expenditure. If I'm an English language learner with a learning disability or challenge, and I'm low income, I'm going to get $19,000. And by the way, this 33% of more funding is 7 percentage points away from what the Leandro recommendation is of 40% more funding for low-income kids in order to achieve equity. So we're inching our way closer to it with each year.
Let's continue on the conversation of funding, because I think that's an important one, and it gets a lot of play when people talk about education. You've actually advocated for changing the K-12 funding formula for greater equity and resource allocation. Help us understand more about what you would propose and how that would impact charter schools.
So our funding system has some inherent inequities in it. For example, if you have two schools and one is in the same town, in the same district, one is a high-performing suburban high school, and the other one is on the other side of town and is a lower-performing, low-income school. Which school are teachers going to want to go and teach at? Well, they're going to by and large apply to the more suburban school that is higher performing. Perhaps it has a better leader. I don't know. But my point is that these two schools have equal funding as a baseline for the students who attend those schools. But because of the way our funding formula works, and this sounds like a good idea at first blush, but this high school over here can pay, and this high school over here can pay whatever they need to pay for those positions, regardless of how much those teachers cost. So if a teacher has a master's degree or has national board certified training, they're going to, and have more years of experience, they're going to cost more. But because of the way our funding structure works, both of those schools will be able to pay for whatever teacher comes their way. That sounds great, but in reality, because of what is known as teacher sorting, those higher qualified, more experienced teachers that cost more are going to choose to go to the school over here. So now all of a sudden, this school has $6 million worth of teachers, while this school over here only has $3 million worth of teachers. And that's not equitable. And so if we provided funding flexibility at the building level to principals, they could then use the salary as a baseline and then pay market rate for hard to staff positions like a math teacher. 95% of schools of kids in North Carolina do not have a fully licensed math teacher.
So in terms of your funding ideas then, how would your ideas specifically impact charter schools? Do you think that charter schools are funded properly, or would you recommend changes?
Well, charter schools receive about 75% of the funding that a district neighborhood school would receive. So if I chose to send my child at the end of the school year, if I disenroll him from my neighborhood public school and send him to a charter school, my neighborhood school will still receive 25% of that per pupil expenditure, and only 75% of that would go to the charter school. So by that math, yes, charter schools do not have equitable funding.
And what would you do about that, if anything?
Well, my recommendation would always be that they should then receive that 100%. They are entitled to the full per pupil expenditure.
What do you make of the idea that the funding itself should be attached to the child versus the school, particularly since you're referring to parents as consumers?
Yes. So I think that this is coming down the pike. I just don't know when. I think that this is otherwise known as backpack funding. And I think that that it makes more sense for the money to follow the child, and that I haven't seen any data on what the financial implications of that would be to both charter schools and to district schools. I can tell you that I would love to see a tax credit given to students, to families who homeschool their children, so that they can have spend money on curriculum or technology, et cetera. And I think that education savings accounts are also something that a lot of other states have that we should be looking at as well.
Do you support the state's Opportunity Scholarship Program?
I support it as it is. I think that when families who are not low income are dissatisfied with their neighborhood public school, that they have the means to send their child to a private school. Low-income families who are actually more likely to be trapped in failing schools, because in North Carolina, zip code and income correlate to outcomes for students, that they do not have that opportunity. And I see the Opportunity Scholarship Program as another piece of equity. And because I feel that way, I don't support the idea that everyone, regardless of income, should have an Opportunity Scholarship. But I do support the program as it exists now. And I would remind viewers that this program, which is a legislative initiative, is actually part of the university system's budget and is run by the State Education Assistance Authority. It does not sit within the office of the State Superintendent.
We mentioned earlier about the fact that there's a wait list for charter schools, about 65,000 students or so. And I understand that you have indicated that you think that where traditional public schools are actually succeeding, that there's not a need for new charters. So can you help us understand your thinking on that and how it fits within your overall view of the relationship between district and charter schools?
So when did I say that?
And if that's incorrect, please correct me.
I don't remember saying that. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I did, but for me, this is a free market principle. If there is a want and a need for charter schools, then they should open. At the same time, I also believe that we should shut down charter schools that are not performing. And I also believe that we should shut down public schools that are not performing, or have some recourse to how they could be improved. Now, the ISD, the Innovative School District, has gone nowhere. I really like the restart model that we have, that they're using in Rowan Salisbury schools. And I think that high-performing charter schools could, if we had a better mechanism for these schools to, if we had a better mechanism for traditional public schools to share best practices and vice versa with charter schools, and we could sort of get past this us and them conversation, which some districts have done, then perhaps all schools would do better. But I would love, if it's very possible that I said that a long time ago. I would love for someone to find that and send it to me if I did, but certainly right now, here today, I don't think that where high performing schools exist, that they should, that we should disallow charter schools. I don't believe that.
Okay. I'm really interested in talking more about something you referred to about the us and them attitude and relationship. And you indicated that there are some districts and charters who've worked out a relationship. Talk a little bit more about that. What do you see happening around the state that you think is productive and maybe could be replicated to improve this relationship?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to call out specific superintendents because I don't necessarily have their permission to talk about them, but I have visited 3 districts that are not only sharing best practices with the charter schools, but they are embracing what I described earlier in the segment about really viewing all students in the community as their responsibility. And so what this would look like for the state superintendent would be convening all of these groups together, treating them the same. I'm actually in favor of giving what is known as charter-like flexibility to traditional public schools, and helping districts move past the perception that charter schools are taking money from them. I haven't seen yet, I'd be interested to see data, if we have it, that shows where if there's been a highly successful charter school in a neighborhood, that has actually had a significant impact on a school's ability to fund what it needs to fund, perhaps in their fixed expenses. But so I'm all about learning more if that is truly what's going on. But I've never seen anything that suggests that a school is unable to take care of its fixed costs because of a successful charter school. And furthermore, schools exist for students, not the other way around.
Catherine, in your background, of course, you've spent a number of years teaching, and West Johnson High School, I believe, was your last teaching assignment, 11th and 12th graders there. I wanted to ask you about a study by Dr. Seth Gershenson of American University. It concluded that here in our state, charter schools have about 35% more Black teachers than district schools, and moreover, Black students in charter schools are about 50% more likely to have a Black teacher than their district public school counterpart.
Mm-hmm.
What's your theory about that?
My theory about that is that we have many minorities serving charter schools that have actually made it a point to invest in a community that is perhaps predominantly, whose residents are predominantly students of color, families of color. And my guess is that these schools have actually recruited teachers of color to teach in these schools, and that these teachers obviously feel supported, because we do know that nationally teachers of color have higher turnover rates. This is something that in my role at WGU I've studied, because we know that that Black women are disproportionately impacted by student debt, because they are more likely to need a flexible program that pushes them to an online program. And for-profit online programs have significantly worse outcomes than an institution like WGU, which, by the way, has an 88% passage rate on the Praxis, which is in line with our great teacher prep programs in North Carolina, and a 96% passage rate on the EdTPA. So we work to make sure that we are giving our students what they need. Every student at WGU has a mentor. And I also think that these charter schools must be providing better supports for new teachers, regardless of race or ethnicity, because that's how we know that's what enables a teacher to stay. It is feeling supported by building leadership, as well as having some sort of mentoring in those early years of teaching.
You know, when you look at issues of economic disparities and ethnic and racial disparities in education, if you look at some of the scores on tests, et cetera, I mean, it's very alarming what you see in some of the subcategories. That's how the scores are divided out by categories of kids. And when you see particularly very low scores or low graduation rates for some minority kids, it just makes you wonder how, after so many years of trying to address that issue and to close that achievement gap, that we really haven't been very successful. Or perhaps you think differently, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that. What is the problem, and why haven't we figured out a way to address it?
So I think, first of all, when the focus is always on more money, more money, more money, that's the wrong focus. That's the wrong. I mean, the amount of misinformation in our state about funding, about charter schools, about what they provide, what they don't provide. Just the amount of misinformation is startling to me. But what I would also say is that we have to focus more on the outputs than on the inputs. Education famously is an area where inputs don't necessarily correlate to outputs. And so if I want to be more specific, I am convinced that our inability to recognize that there is a superior way to teach kids how to read, and that way is described in the Science of Reading and the 5 panels of early literacy, pillars, of early literacy instruction. And that is all just a fancy way of saying phonics through direct instruction in the classroom. 65% of teachers are not doing that. And this is national as well as statewide data. And guess what? It just so happens that 65% of kids in the 8th grade or actually 67%, are not reading proficiently headed into 9th grade. This is something that Mississippi got laser focused on 5 years ago. They launched a statewide campaign that brought in parents, and they created legislation to support this. We already have that legislation in Read to Achieve, which Senator Berger is fully committed to making fixes to Read to Achieve legislation that have not worked so far in raising 3rd grade proficiency in reading. Those fixes were laid out in legislation this past session, and they do align with the Science of Reading, and that legislation was vetoed by the governor. And Mississippi was the only state to see significant gains across all subgroups in reading in 2019. So that is one of the first things that I would do. I would ensure that we are deploying reading coaches that are trained in the Science of Reading. This is about people, not programs. This is not about adopting a new curriculum or something like that. This is about making sure that whatever curriculum teachers have, that they are trained in the Science of Reading and how to teach research with research-backed methods of early literacy instruction.
Catherine, since we're talking about accountability, I'd like the last topic we discussed this evening to be about expectations and accountability and controls, et cetera, for charter schools. The most recent Charter School Performance Framework report noted that 95.6% of charter schools met or exceeded all financial and operational goals. So, do you think that charter schools in our state have the appropriate oversight, the appropriate accountability? And if not, what would you change and why?
Well, first of all, let me just say that that framework is a beast. That is some serious accountability right there. It is more than what any other school has to provide, or any traditional public schools have to provide, as is the charter school application. You know, when I was in the governor's office, that was something that I did. I helped the Charter School Advisory Board comb through those applications with a fine-tooth comb. And of course, we rejected more than we accepted. And we have some charter schools who apply year after year after year, and they're not allowed to open until that charter school is right. And I also want to add that part of the charter school application, this is part of my myth-busting quest, part of that charter school application asks, how will you provide transportation and nutrition to students who would not have it, that it would be a barrier for them to attend this school if they didn't have it. Most of our 50% of our charter schools provide transportation, and much more than that provide nutrition to students. So the other thing that I want to point out, just in terms of finance, because you brought it up, is that 80% of charter schools in North Carolina are run by a CMO, which is a nonprofit organization. Only 20% of charters are run by EMOs, which are a for-profit organization. However, all charter school boards are nonprofit boards. So this argument that charter schools, this comes from my opponent, that charter schools are making money off the backs of kids is absolutely false. All schools, regardless of whether they are charter schools or public schools, have vendors that they engage with, and those vendors are for-profit vendors. And it's no different with charter schools. So that said, I think that charter schools are held to a higher level of scrutiny than traditional public schools, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that at all. The State Board of Education holds the charter for a charter school, and the State Board of Education can close down a charter school at any time for a cause. And so I don't think it's a question of accountability, Donna. I think it's more of a question of, let's reinvigorate the charge that charter schools have around sharing best practices, and let's create the conditions that allow that to happen between charter schools and their district counterparts.
And finally, this evening, Catherine, just want to give you a final brief moment to give the audience your final thoughts. Of course, you got a lot of charter school parents and those interested in charter schools watching right now. You have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Donna. I really like the way the association and the coalition describe charter schools as politically fragile. It's very interesting to me that charter school expansion was an outgrowth of President Obama's administration, and yet forces in Washington, D.C. now have mandated that charter schools are a political football. And what I would love to see is the politics taken out of this conversation, and that we focus on whether or not charter schools are serving the students that they are, letting parents have a choice, and recognizing that it is not the state's responsibility to tell a parent what is best for their child. And so I look forward to collaborating with homeschool leaders and with charter school leaders, with magnet school leaders, early college leaders, as well as our traditional public school leaders because they all play a role. You know, let me point something out real quick. North Carolina is known for its fabulous university system, right? We've got a wonderful public UNC system with 17 campuses, and then we have 34 independent and private universities and colleges, and they coexist pretty peacefully, allowing for lots of people to have choice. It should be the same thing with our charter schools and our traditional public schools.
Catherine, thank you for talking with me this evening. I really appreciate it. And back over to Rhonda and Lindalyn.
Thanks, Donna.
Thank you, Donna. We appreciate your expertise in asking those hard questions, those tough questions. And Catherine, we thank you. We appreciate your candor and taking the time to spend with charter leaders across the state. The coalition is a 501c6, which allows us to be more direct in the election process. And we have been vetting and researching all the candidates that directly affect charter funding and regulation. We want to make sure everybody knows the governor appoints 11 of the 13 members of the State Board of Education for 8-year terms. And both the lieutenant governor and the treasurer are ex officio members of the State Board of Education. And then, of course, the legislature is responsible for dispersing the funding. So every North Carolina House and every North Carolina Senate race is important. Next week, the coalition will produce some palm cards listing candidates that support fair, just funding and autonomy of charter schools. And I'm contacting parents from charter schools across our state, empowering them to communicate with voters, letting voters know which candidates support our advocacy goals for the charter schools in our state. Let me encourage everyone, for the next 41 days, there is no other important work that we must engage in if we are going to achieve our goals, our advocacy goals. Please contact me directly or give my contact information to parents. Rhonda, thank you so much for partnering with us. We thoroughly enjoy working with you. And why don't you conclude our evening?
I'll be glad to. And thank you. Also, I've really enjoyed this collaboration and getting to know Dr. Mangrum and Chancellor Truitt. And I'm sure our constituents out there have appreciated this opportunity to get to know them as well. I'd like to thank everyone for listening tonight and to remind you that the candidate questionnaires that we've mentioned earlier can be found on both the association's and the coalition's websites. As Lindalyn said, we encourage everyone to get involved in the process. Please be sure that you're registered to vote and then vote. And make sure you encourage those that you have influence over to do that as well. I'd like to be sure to make you aware that we have events posted on the association's website, so please visit it and stay up to date on what we're doing at ncpubliccharters.org. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Lindalyn. And I'd like to say good night to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.